Our next presenter is going to be talking about some of the differences between boys and girls. She is joining us via Skype or Zoom. And for her presentation, we're actually going to be doing a few questions right after, just so we can let her go. Our next presenter is Alexandra Sturrock. I hope I pronounced that right. Yes? Okay. And she is a PhD candidate in her final year of study. Her research focuses on gender differences in language and communication difficulties for autistic children with high-functioning intellectual ability. Her research interests were germinated during her clinical work as a speech and language therapist in the field of autism spectrum disorder. She was recently awarded Student Faculty Winner for Public and Patient Engagement for a raft of collaborative activities, bringing autistic individuals into the heart of research activity. So please join me in welcoming Alexandra Sturrock up. You will be able to hear her talk. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see her as she's speaking. Oh, you will. Oh, there she is. Okay, perfect. So please welcome Alexandra Sturrock in her talk.
Hello, and I think it's morning over there, although I'm talking to you from the UK, so it's about 6:30 in the evening here. So as Sana just said, I'm a speech and language therapist originally, and I sort of see myself as that first and foremost, even though I've now gone into research. I started working with autistic kids a long while ago now, and they've always been my special area of clinical interest, and I've loved working with them. But it was when I moved from working in schools and started working in a diagnostic team for adults that I started to see more females coming through. I think I'd hardly seen any females in the schools that I worked in. It was virtually all boys. And then I started working in this diagnostic team for adults. And I started seeing more and more women coming through, women of all ages, mostly describing to me this long-standing difficulty with autistic symptomology, but without a diagnosis. Often they'd been through mental health services, and they didn't really know what was going on. So I think I started to get interested at that point. I started to research what was around to help me diagnose these individuals, and there just wasn't really that much stuff about. So I then thought, well, I need to be part of the solution here, and I need to start looking for research. So I started to sort of compile information. I went to Manchester University and I put forward my proposal study, and really all surrounded this idea of what is going on with this group of what seem to be missed women with autism symptomology. Let's start with, I mean, you all know the definition of autism. I don't know if the ratios are the same in Canada as they are here, but recently we've had a prevalence rating that says 1 female is diagnosed for every 3 males. This is the sort of information I was finding out when I first started looking into this, and it seemed incredible to me what's going on here. So in particular, we were seeing real big problems with diagnosing these higher IQ women, and they were much lower in the ratio. So sometimes as low as 1 female for every 5 males being diagnosed. And I guess I just wanted to know why that was happening. So I started my studies by looking at what was available at the time. The evidence seems to be suggesting that really what's going on here is that the current definition of autism is basically based on male presentation of symptoms. So that goes back to the early days of, Kanner and Asperger really only sort of looking at male cases when they did their definitions of autism, and that's kind of seeped into research, and it's seeped into our diagnostic criteria, and it's kind of skewed the way we see autism. We basically only see it from a male perspective. There's quite a lot of evidence to suggest now that there is maybe a female phenotype. So the reason I've put these pictures here is I think some of these characters are how even today we see or we perceive of autism. we have like the young professor type character, the Big Bang Sheldon character, who's quite a stereotype of the little professor. We have the savant in the Rain Man, and we have like the little boy who likes to line things up, maybe non-verbal, and likes to line things up. And those are kind of the public images of what is autism. And if the public think like that, and the teachers think like that, and the clinicians think like that, then really we're not seeing the female presentation. And the female presentation might look very different. So you probably won't be familiar with the person on the far left of the screen, but that is Susan Boyle, who was made a big name for herself here for singing, and she was diagnosed autistic after a big TV show over here. But she had great pitch perception, so she had those sort of savant skills in an area of pitch perception and musical ability. And in the middle, you've got Daryl Hannah, who was a famous movie star who was autistic and had such a big, strong interest in acting that she made a whole family move across America to pursue that. And on the right, we've got a young lady who was on a British TV show not that long ago about pathological demand avoidance. So the little girl who's quite sociable but is so anxious about being taken out of her comfort zone that she kind of refuses to do things. And this profile is just so much less understood or recognised by the general public. I mean, I'm basically going to talk through some of my literature review and hopefully look at some of the key points that I've come across really as to what's going on from now on, really. So it seems that females are being missed. There's been quite a lot of research into this, and when they've looked at whole population studies of people who have the symptoms of autism, they see that fewer of those people are diagnosed if they're women, and more of them are diagnosed if they're men. There are more women being diagnosed with other disorders, so different neurodevelopmental disorders like language delay or ADHD or global developmental disorder. And there are certainly more women, especially in the sort of higher IQ groups, that are being diagnosed with things like mental health disorders, anxiety, depression, and the one that keeps rearing its head is borderline personality disorder, where there seems to be quite a lot of crossover. And when they are getting diagnosed, they're getting diagnosed at a later age, which explains why I was seeing these women when they were coming to clinic, in post-18 services. But I was diagnosing women up to the age of about 75, I think was my oldest lady that I diagnosed. So I just want to point out that really this surge of understanding that's happened in the last few years has come from the ground up. And most of the evidence we've seen has been because women are great advocates for themselves. And I think you're going to hear, or you already have heard, women speakers already. But it's really been a push from the community to say, look, we're here, we have different symptomology, and please take notice of us. So there's just a few things that I've come across over my time. So now I'm going to just talk about what we know so far about some of the differences. So let's start with social skills. It seems that it's more likely that a female with an autistic symptomology will have a best friend. So more likely to have a friend than a boy who might be considered aloof, might fit the original profile of the classic profile of aloof and alone. There's some evidence some evidence that friend might be an older friend who can mother them and kind of look after them and show them how to behave in social situations and help guide them. They might have a younger female friend or a male friend, and that seems to be about these kind of reduced social expectations, that they are going to feel less judged by their peers. Or they may, this seems to be I often do this talk with a friend of mine who is autistic and a speech and language therapist herself. And one of the things she always says is that, she became over-reliant on one friend who then sort of guided her all the way through school and secondary school. Girls are more likely to be more empathic and have more reciprocity in their empathy, but also in their conversation skills. There's also evidence that they might have a different type of play behaviour. So often in clinical diagnostic teams, we might ask if the child can do pretend play. Boys typically with autism don't do great pretend play. It seems that girls with autism do better pretend play. But again, it's worth looking at that in some detail because, again, my friend who often does this talk with me, she says that she used to line her toys up as if they were kind of doing some interactive activity like a tea party, but then she kind of didn't know how to elaborate on that. So she was doing pretend play, but it was more limited. And other people have explained to me that they are likely to do the same type of play over and over again, so it becomes repetitive. So they've learned a model of a pretend play scenario, and they do that over and over again. Quite a lot of research now has suggested that women with autism might show fewer repetitive behaviours, but I would question that. Again, clinically, this isn't the area of my study, but clinically I just know that women I've talked to would definitely say that they have intense interests. And I've just put a few things up here that I have been told about. So I've been told about collections. Well, if you think about someone collecting Lego or toy trains, which is a boy activity, that might look more linear, more lined up. But if you think about someone collecting teddy bears, it might look less lined up. But having excessive amounts. There's someone once told me about this wonderful thing. I don't know if you call it the same thing over there, but it's called yarn bombing, where you basically knit around lampposts and trees and all sorts of things. And I had this one woman who went out and did this every night. This was a big interest for her. And I've also had ladies turning up to clinic dressed as their favourite fantasy fiction person. So these are really intense interests for these people. It doesn't seem to be maybe as impacting on their negatively on their life, but it's certainly intense and repetitive and focused. There seems to be a real difference around internalizing versus externalizing behaviours. This was so much so that when I did my study, I was reported this so much during my research that we actually changed the study a little bit to include not only parents' reports, but also teachers' reports. And what we were finding was that girls were much more likely to cover up their behaviours, their difficulties, their sensory difficulties, and internalise any feelings they had towards that during school time, and then would take this home, and it would be at home in a safe space where it would come out and be exposed. And so I'm a big advocate of really involving parents very heavily in the diagnosis of girls, and maybe involving schools, but maybe trying to balance out the fact that they might not be expressing some of those difficulties during school, or it may come across as things like anxiety rather than a sensory behaviour. The sensory behaviour itself might be covered up and taken home. And now on to my particular area of interest, which is language and communication. So before myself and people like Olivia, who you have there at the University of Alberta, before we started doing our work, there had been very little done on actual language assessments, but there had been a little bit done on some things around communication, usually from diagnostic schedules and things like that. So it turns out that women are more motivated to communicate. They may have better reciprocity, so their turn taking might be better. They're likely to have better non-verbal communication, so using gesture. Now, if classical clinician type criteria might say if they used hand gesture and body language, then they're not autistic. Women are likely to be able to use that stuff. And then I've got this about mimicking voices, so they might be able to mimic accents and come across as more kind of socially appropriate. This all goes into feed in towards this idea of this masking, this camouflaging that you might hear about from other presenters tonight. So more recently, we have looked at language and communication. And like I say, Olivia on your side of the pond was looking at narrative skills in particular and found differences in narrative skills between boys and girls. And the thing is, girls with autism are going to be better at these sorts of skills, which is not really a surprise because we are actually slightly better at these kind of things with typical developing populations. So we're just looking at natural levels of difference here. But I then published something earlier this year and found differences in things like inference, so understanding idioms and metaphors and that sort of thing. Girls with autism were better at that. They were better at semantic word knowledge, so they could recall a larger number of words around a certain category, and they had better language of emotions than males with autism. All of those are than males with autism. However, the other thing my study showed, I guess, was that they were falling behind when compared to typically developing peers, so typically developing girls. And that's where the problem lies, because even though they're performing better than males with autism on some of these skills, they're actually performing as part of a slope of skill. So typically developing girls were performing the best on this. Boys with autism were performing kind of down the bottom end, and girls with autism and boys with typical development were performing somewhere in the middle. So girls with autism are having a similar level of difficulty compared to their typically developing peers as boys are with their typically developing peers. So their difficulties are just as real functionally within their own peer group. Just a few other things there. I'm nearly at the end now. So there's differences in communication experiences. We believe that communication is more integral to female friendship groups, that it has greater impact on social outcomes because of that integralness of communication to those friendships. And as such, they're more likely to perceive the difficulties that they have, maybe than parents of boys. They have a different profile across time, and that seems to be that as they get older, those difficulties are greater when compared to their typically developing peers. So they perform better as a younger person, but as they get past their adolescence, then they start really struggling as demand outstrips capacity. So my conclusions really are that girls have a more subtle presentation of symptoms, but that doesn't stop them struggling functionally when compared to their typically developing female group. And this does have a huge impact on their ability to build relationships and on their emotional well-being. And if there's any clinicians in the audience today, I would suggest that you need to compare your children's performance or your adults' performance against their typically developing peers from the same gender group, rather than just to other people with autism. And the other thing we really found was different vocabulary and sentence level task was not a good marker for understanding whether a child had language difficulties. That was with the boys or the girls. You need to look at narrative and discourse skills for this group of children with autism but with higher intellectual function. Vocabulary and sentence won't tell you anything. And I advocate bespoke support, especially, well, for both groups, but especially the girls where maybe those deficits aren't really fully understood, looking at the peer group and then matching intervention to where they're struggling with their peer group. My research has been supported by all these people. That's the end of my presentation, if you've got any questions.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for that great presentation. So Lori will actually be walking around if anybody has any questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
So my question is, it's a bit more theoretical, but I just, because you said female relationships, we know that female relationships tend to be more communication focused and stuff like that. Would you say that theoretically, if there was a bit more, I guess, like gender diversity among friend groups, that we might potentially see autism symptoms expressed differently in boys? Like, say, if they're in a more female-oriented peer group, could we see something like that?
Okay, that's interesting. I imagine yes. Well, I imagine yes, based on some clinical experience as well. I mean, so a lot of the girls that I met tend to hang around a bit with boys with typical development because of the lower sort of social demands. But also, I have met a lot of boys who hang around with girls, typically developing girls, for the nurturing aspect of that. And when I have met those characters, they seem to have really benefited from being around females. They seem to have better gesture and eye contact and things like that. So I don't really know the answer, but that is my clinical experience. So I'd like to think that it would be beneficial for both groups, really, building esteem and building some of those skills. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That I know it's super hypothetical scenario, but yeah, thank you very much for answering. It's awesome.
Yeah, I just as a build on point of that, and which I should have said right at the beginning, but actually I have met lots of girls who say to me, well, I don't really fit the girl profile, I actually fit the boy profile better. And I've met boys that say I fit the girl profile better. So I just want to emphasize that these are group norms. And I hope that the whole thing about talking about girls with autism will eventually lead to a better discussion about autism more generally.
Okay.
What is key features? Because actually, I think there's a lot of these are literally just gender norms, and there's a lot of diversity within that population. So,
gotcha. Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you.
You can't see me because I can't get up there with my mobility problems. But the thing is that I'm a female to male transgender person, and I found that being the way that I expressed my autism when I was raised as a girl was difficulty. But there seems to be a connection between I'm transgender, so I was raised female, and the thing is that I'm now a male. With the gender dysphoria, there seems to be a link to that and females with autism.
Sana, can you just repeat that for me? I'm having trouble.
There seems to be a connection between gender dysphoria and females with autism, who they become female to male transgender individuals like myself.
Well, it's not my area of research, but having got involved in gender, I really do realise that there's something really important here that needs to be explored a lot more. And I have got a friend who's at the University of Manchester who does a lot of work with transgender groups, and we have talked quite a bit about we would like to explore this a little bit more, maybe together, with him coming from his background of working with transgender groups and me coming from my background of working with autism and gender difference. I think it would be really fascinating, and I wouldn't at all be surprised if there was something really helpful that we could learn from understanding that a bit better. I'm sorry I don't have any answers, but I believe there's something to be explored there, yeah.
By email. Great. Thank you, Alex. We are going to let you go, but thank you very much for spending your evening with us today. And we will get started, I guess, with our next presenter. But thank you, Alex, very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Sana. Bye.